Hi again, everybody. Lindsay here, your friendly community psychology professor. What I'd like to do now is an introduction to your week one content. So, your week one content covers chapters 1 and 2 of your textbook. So, let's take a look at your week. Here we are. There we go. Chapter 1. So chapter 1 of your textbook introduces community psychology. So what I'm going to do is run through the slides for these weeks, or rather these chapters, and talk a little bit more about some of the concepts that we're introducing in these chapters. All right, so chapter 1, introducing community psychology. Let's get into some of the definitions, some of the concepts that you're going to need to be familiar with for this class. All right, so a logical place to start seems like defining psychology. This may be the first psychology class that some of you have taken. So let's start there, and then we'll build on that and talk about what community psychology is. All right, so psychology. Psychology is the study of behavior, mental and emotional processes, our thoughts, our feelings, how those thoughts and feelings make us act and behave in certain ways, etc. Now, psychology has traditionally focused on the individual, him or herself, right? So, how people themselves think, feel, behave, etc. And often, how that impacts the family, etc. Now, community psychology. What is the difference between psychology and community psychology? What do we do a little differently? So let's start with the definition of community, of course. Now, community, this is probably a term that we're all, just familiar with from our own lives, but this is obviously some kind of group of people. Either they've grouped themselves together through a shared endeavor, like, maybe they're all on a soccer team, or maybe they all go, to the same religious organization or something like that, right? Or perhaps they share a locality, a geographic location. Maybe they all literally live in the city of London, for example, the community of London, etc. So there's some kind of linkage amongst these people. Now, what we do in community psychology, basically, community psych looks at the relationships that individuals have with their community and their society. So, what we try to do is understand those psychology pieces, right? The thinking, the feeling, the behaving pieces of the definition of psychology, and how that then relates to the way that we belong or the way that we are in relationship with other people, or our community or our society. Basically, what we do is we try to integrate research with action, and we try to understand how we can enhance quality of life for people, so the individuals, but also for communities and societies as well. So that's our definition of community psychology. Now, again, one of the examples that I often go to when I think about community psychology is the example of homelessness, right? Why do people become homeless? Why do so many people become homeless? The answer that people often jump to when they think about why people become homeless is, maybe they're lazy, right? Maybe these are people, they just weren't trying hard enough, they got fired from their job, that kind of thing. Maybe they had an addiction, um, etc. Now, what we try to do in community psychology is look at a social issue like homelessness and think, well, yeah, maybe there are people who maybe they didn't try hard enough, right? To keep a job or, that kind of thing. So maybe there are explanations for homelessness that are at what we would call the individual level. But maybe there are also some other explanations, like What about the family that this person came from, for example? What about the community that this person came from? Is this a community where affordable housing is available? Is this a community where there are supports and services available? Do they have support from their family members, for example? So these are the kinds of hard questions that we try to ask about these kinds of social issues, how they impact people and their family, their individual health and well-being. But also we try to take a very critical perspective of really understanding the issue and all the kinds of things that can cause it. So what we do is we try to shift perspectives in community psychology. We try to, of course, look at this individual level, but we also try to understand what are some of the factors that can cause these kinds of issues at the community level, at the society level, for example. You know, if you live in a country that does not have universal health care, a little bit of a topical issue right now, and you get sick, right? You know, what are you going to do? Say you're lucky and you do live in a country that has these kinds of things available to you, these kinds of services built into your government. You know, people are going to have very different experiences, and sometimes it's not their fault that they're having these different experiences. All right, so in community psychology, we are all about societal change. Two key concepts here: first order change, second order change. First order change, what we do here is we address the problem. So for example, a soup kitchen, which you can see in the picture here, which is being half covered by my face. But essentially, a soup kitchen or homeless shelter, these are two kinds of community services that help people who are experiencing poverty or homelessness, right? They're important community services that do a lot of really good work for members of the community. Now, what a soup kitchen and homeless shelter do, unfortunately, or what they don't do rather, is they don't necessarily address the underlying root causes of poverty and homelessness, right? They're what we might call a Band-Aid issue. They help people who are experiencing the problem. They're important. We're not going to get rid of them, right? But they're not really doing anything to really deal with the issue of homelessness and poverty. So what we then look at is second order change. Second order change is what we would consider to be a more oomphy transformational social change that really looks at addressing the root causes of a social issue and preventing them from reoccurring. So again, in the example of affordable housing, or rather poverty and homelessness, we would look at something like affordable housing. Now, one of the things we're going to talk a little bit about in our course is a project that is being undertaken by a number of communities in Ontario and Canada. London is taking this approach called Housing First. Now, Housing First is what we would call a second order transformational approach to social change. Basically, Housing First is, let's just get people into houses. If you're homeless, let's get you into a house, right? Because traditional approaches to helping people who were homeless were, okay, well, we need to help you with your addiction issue, we need to help you with your mental health problem, we need to help you find a job, and when all these things are in place, then we're going to get you a house. But what the data is actually saying, and this is based on really, really well done studies, like over decades, is that no, people just need a house. Really, that's what we need to do. We need to get folks houses. We need to get them off the streets. And once they do, things start to stabilize, right? And then we find that they can get the job, they can deal with their addiction issue, they can deal with their mental health problems, etc. And then they start, being kind of our quote-unquote contributing member of society again because they've got an income, they're contributing to tax collect, that kind of thing, right? So a bit of a different approach. Now, the ecological levels of analysis is another really important aspect of community psychology. I'm just going to see where we're at in our time here for our video. Okay, yeah, we've got about 5 minutes left. All right, so it was the ecological levels of analysis were introduced by this lovely fellow here, Urie Bronfenbrenner, in the 1970s. And I'm going to walk you through this mess of a diagram here. So the ecological levels of analysis are a way for us to analyze a social problem according to different levels, essentially. So we look at individual explanations, but we also look at larger levels of explanations or factors that affect a social issue. So let's start with number one, the individual level. So obviously with a social issue, we would look at how individuals themselves are responsible for this particular issue, right? And so interventions here, basically what they can do is they can address individual well-being, mental health, etc. So again, if this is a homeless person, we're going to deal with his or her individual issues and how we can help that person. Good, important, right? Next, we're going to talk about microsystems. Microsystems are huge, 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 huge impacts and factors that affect people and affect how their mental health, well-being, social issues, all of these things, right? So let's talk about examples of microsystems first. A microsystem is something like a family, your network of friends. It could even be something like a classroom or the people that you work with. These are microsystems. Microsystems are places or environments where we repeatedly engage directly with other people on a day-to-day basis. So these have huge impacts on our mental health and well-being. They're often a huge source of support, right? If we are a person who is very stressed or experiencing depression, our family, friends, group, colleagues rather at work, these are people that we're often going to turn to for help. However, these are also often very big sources of stress for people. For example, if you come from an abusive family, right, that's going to be a huge source of stress for you, and it can cause you to be experiencing social issues, psychological issues like depression, anxiety, etc. Now let's talk about the third level, organizations. So organizations are slightly larger than microsystems. They can have some microsystems that are hosted within them. There are things like schools, workplaces, etc. Now, organizations are also going to be a really important factor that contribute to our mental health and well-being. For example, if you work at an organization that is very progressive, places value on hiring diverse people, for example, we see that things like that are really helpful. On the other hand, say you don't work for an organization like that, that can really impact your mental health and well-being as well. Now, we also know that the locality that we live in can have a very big impact on our mental health and well-being. The example that I gave of, if you live in a country that doesn't have healthcare, or if you live in a city that doesn't have services like other cities do, that's going to impact how well you fare in a certain issue. And then we have macro systems, which would be a little bit more of what we just talked about how governments impact our mental health and well-being. So again, excuse me, the example that I just gave around healthcare, that's actually a bit more of a macro system example. All right, so that's where I'll end things for now. I'm going to do another tutorial about some other things for this week, some other topics, and you can watch for that next. Okay, thanks guys. Ciao.